The gas lamps flickered feebly against the encroaching twilight, casting elongated shadows that danced across the cobblestone streets of London. The air was thick with the mingled scents of damp earth and smoke, a testament to the city's unrelenting pulse even as the day waned. It was on this somber evening, the 14th of November, in the year of our Lord 1831, that the death of a young woman would send ripples through the fabric of society, igniting a fierce debate that would echo across parlors and taverns alike. In a modest tenement tucked away in the East End, the dimly lit room bore witness to a most tragic scene. Elizabeth Turner, a mere 18 years of age, lay motionless upon a threadbare mattress. Her pallor was a stark contrast to the faded floral patterns that adorned the walls, remnants of a once vibrant life. A thin sheet, yellowed with age, barely covered her frail form, its edges frayed by time and neglect. The room, cluttered with the remnants of a meager existence, an overturned chair, a cracked mirror, seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the weight of loss that had settled within its confines. The sound of hurried footsteps approached, the sharp rap of a knotted cane striking the floorboards with urgency. Mr. Samuel Worthington, a local constable, entered the room, his countenance drawn tight with concern. He was a man of stout build, with a broad-brimmed hat perched atop his head, its shadow obscuring the deep lines etched by years of service. Kneeling beside Elizabeth, he pressed his fingers to her wrist, searching for the faintest pulse, but finding only the coldness of death. The eyes that had once sparkled with dreams now stared blankly into the void, leaving only the echoes of what could have been. "Fetch the doctor," he commanded, his voice a low rumble, filled with urgency. The words hung heavy in the air as he rose, casting a glance around the room, taking in the disarray and the staleness of despair. The constable's thoughts raced. The circumstances of her passing were shrouded in mystery. Whispers of illness had drifted through the narrow streets, tales of fever that had gripped the poor with merciless fervor. Yet there was more that gnawed at his mind, a nagging suspicion of foul play. As he stepped back into the chill of the evening, the weight of the world pressed upon him. The constable could hear the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the cries of street vendors hawking their wares, and the laughter of children playing in the shadows. Yet the life of Elizabeth Turner had been extinguished, and with it the flicker of hope for a brighter future. Beyond the walls of the tenement, the news of her death spread like wildfire. In the homes of the affluent, where velvet drapes fluttered in the dying light, the incident ignited heated discussions. To the upper echelons of society, Elizabeth's demise was but another grim reminder of the plight of the poor. In the smoke-filled taverns, men raised their tankards in outrage, debating the failures of the government and the widening chasm between the classes. Meanwhile, in the darker alleys of the city, those who knew Elizabeth whispered tales of her kindness, of her dreams of becoming a seamstress, a provider for her family. But now, those dreams lay buried alongside her, and the city continued its relentless march forward, indifferent to the loss of a single flickering light in the vast expanse of humanity. The chill of autumn had settled over Whitechapel, a heavy fog rolling in from the Thames like a shroud, cloaking the narrow, cobbled streets in shadows. It was on the early morn of August 31st, 1888, that the world of the East End would shift irrevocably, as the lifeless body of a young woman was discovered in Buck's Row. Mary Ann Nichols, a mere 43 years old, lay sprawled upon the damp earth, her once vibrant spirit extinguished. The dawn light, pale and wan, crept over the rooftops, illuminating the gruesome scene. A nearby constable, on his routine patrol, stumbled upon the sight that would ignite a frenzy throughout the city. The girl's dress, tattered and stained, barely concealed the horrific evidence of violence. Her throat had been slashed with a precision that sent a shiver through the officer's spine, while deep gashes marred her abdomen, as if some ravenous beast had feasted upon her very essence. News of the murder spread like wildfire, carried on the hushed whispers of the working class and the fearful clutches of the upper echelons. In pubs and parlors, the name Mary Ann Nichols became synonymous with dread. The poor woman, whose life had been one of hardship, now served as the catalyst for the vivid imaginings of the populace. Rumors took root, twisting through the alleyways and over the rickety fences of Whitechapel. Could it be that a vampire lurked in the shadows, preying upon the vulnerable? Such tales, born of ignorance and fear, began to entwine with the grim reality of the streets. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere thickened with an unnameable tension. The scent of coal smoke mingled with the lingering musk of the river, while the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages echoed through the narrow roads. Gathered in clusters, men and women shared their theories, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and intrigue. A vampire, they said, would stalk the night, drawn to the despair that clung to the air like a fog. The poor souls of Whitechapel were said to be particularly vulnerable, their lives a reflection of darkness that beckoned the supernatural. The local press, eager for a story that would sell papers, fanned the flames of hysteria. Headlines proclaimed the existence of a vampire of Whitechapel, detailing the gruesome nature of Nichols' demise and suggesting that she was but the first in a series of sinister acts. The notion of a bloodsucker roaming the night struck a chord in the hearts of the people, who had long been accustomed to fear, but now faced an enemy they could not see. In the days that followed, the streets became a stage for the macabre. Constables patrolled with greater vigilance, yet the shadows seemed to deepen around them, mocking their efforts. Mothers clutched their children closer, forbidding them from wandering too far, as the specter of the vampire loomed over the district. It was a time of uncertainty, when the line between reality and myth blurred, and the death of Mary Ann Nichols became a haunting refrain, echoing through the hearts of those in a city already steeped in despair. Thus, the tragedy of one young woman transformed into a tale of terror, a catalyst for fear that would grip London, leaving an indelible mark upon its history. The shadows of Whitechapel had swallowed another soul, but in their wake, they birthed a legend that would haunt the streets long after the fog had lifted. The air in London hung heavy with a damp chill, as the early morning fog cloaked the city in an eerie shroud. It was the 5th day of January in the year of our Lord 1832, and a palpable tension coursed through the narrow streets where shadows clung to the cobblestones like specters of the past. At the edge of St. George's Fields, a crowd had gathered, their murmurs mingling with the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the soft echo of church bells tolling the hour. They were drawn to the ominous spectacle unfolding at the graveyard, where the exhumation of bodies had been ordered, a macabre necessity born of medical urgency and public health. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, a foreboding reminder of the lives that had once animated these now lifeless forms. The authorities had deemed it essential to investigate the spread of cholera, a disease that had claimed countless souls in its merciless grip. In the wake of the epidemic, the graveyards were overflowing, and the time-worn soil could no longer hide its secrets. The specter of mortality loomed, and the living clamored for answers from the departed. Amidst the crowd, a group of laborers, clad in threadbare coats and woolen caps, had been summoned to the task. Their faces were drawn, etched with the weariness of long hours and the knowledge that they would soon disturb eternal rest. Armed with wooden spades and iron shovels, they approached the freshly marked graves with a grim resolve. A few onlookers gasped, while others turned their eyes away, unwilling to witness the grim rite that was about to unfold. As the first shovel broke the surface, a hollow thud reverberated through the air, sending a tremor of apprehension through the crowd. The laborers worked with an urgency born of necessity, each scoop of earth revealing the remnants of a life once cherished. The damp soil yielded reluctantly, as if clinging to its secrets. With every shovelful, the atmosphere grew heavier, charged with an unspoken dread. The very act of exhumation felt like a transgression against the natural order. The first coffin emerged, its wood weathered and splintering, the brass fittings tarnished by time and the elements. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the lid was pried open, revealing the rotting remains within. It was a young woman, her features softened by the passage of time, yet the pallor of death clung to her like a shroud. The laborers recoiled, but their task was not yet complete. They were compelled by duty, and the weight of public scrutiny bore down upon them. As the bodies were unearthed, the cries of the mourners broke the heavy silence. A widow clad in black stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for the remains of her beloved. Tears streamed down her cheeks, mingling with the mud beneath her feet. The act of exhumation had become a brutal reminder of loss, yet it was also a desperate attempt to understand the affliction that had robbed her of joy. The tension in the air thickened, a blend of sorrow and outrage. As the implications of the day's events began to unfurl, with each body revealed, the question of accountability loomed larger. Who was to blame for the cholera that had ravaged the city? There were whispers of negligence, of filth and disease lurking in the shadows of London's streets. The exhumation was not merely an act of science, it was a reckoning, a confrontation with the consequences of human actions that echoed long after the last shovelful of earth had been cast aside. The chill of early morning settled over the rural graveyards of London, casting an eerie pallor over the weathered stones and crumbling earth. As the sun struggled to break through a shroud of fog, a somber procession of local authorities and townsfolk gathered outside the ancient churchyard of St. Mary's. Whispers of dread coiled through the air, thick and suffocating, as the specter of vampirism gripped the community with an iron fist. The authorities, clad in dark coats and solemn expressions, wielded shovels and pickaxes, their movements deliberate yet reluctant. They had come to exhume the dead, compelled by a fear that had seeped into the very marrow of their bones. The recent spate of mysterious deaths, pale faces, sunken eyes, and a disquieting stillness in the night had fanned the flames of superstition. The notion that the undead might stir from their slumber, rising to prey upon the living, had taken root in the minds of the populace. As the first shovel struck the damp earth, a collective breath was held. The sound of metal scraping against stone echoed through the graveyard, a harbinger of impending horror. With each thrust of the spade, the soil yielded reluctantly, as if the very ground were protesting the disturbance of its slumbering inhabitants. The townsfolk, drawn by morbid curiosity, clutched their shawls tighter, eyes wide with a mix of trepidation and fascination. The grave of a woman named Eliza Thorne was the first to be opened. Her family had buried her just weeks prior, her life extinguished by an illness that had ravaged her body. Now, as the onlookers peered over the makeshift barrier, the lid of the coffin was pried open, revealing the pale, waxen visage of the deceased. Gasps of horror mingled with whispers of disbelief swept through the crowd. Her body, untouched by decay, lay perfectly still, dressed in a simple white shroud. Yet, as the officials inspected her, a grim realization set in. Her lips appeared unnaturally red, and her fingernails, though trimmed, were conspicuously long. An audible murmur rippled through the gathering, the men exchanging furtive glances, while women clutched their children closer, eyes darting, as if the very shadows bore witness to their fears. "See, she is a vampire," a voice cried out, trembling with conviction. "She has not decomposed. She shall rise again." With that proclamation, the onlookers erupted into a frenzy of panic, some clutching rosaries, while others brandished crude wooden stakes, emboldened by superstition. The air crackled with tension, a palpable fear that spiraled into chaos. The authorities, overwhelmed by the sudden surge of hysteria, sought to restore order, but found themselves ensnared in the web of rising dread. As the sun broke free from the confines of the fog, casting its feeble light upon the scene, the mood shifted. There could be no denying the morbid fascination which had taken hold of the hearts of the observers. The authorities, caught between duty and dread, pressed on, unearthing the corpses of the long dead, each exhumation feeding the growing anxiety. As more graves yielded their secrets, each revelation deepened the townsfolk's obsession, drawing them ever closer to the brink of madness. The very act of disturbing the dead transformed into a grotesque spectacle, one that blurred the line between life and death, reality and fiction. Each corpse unearthed brought forth new tales of the undead, feeding a hunger for certainty in a world that had become irrevocably entwined with the dark. The dead, once laid to rest, had become vessels of fear, and the graveyard, a theater of the macabre. As the pallid moon hung low in the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the cobbled streets of Chelmsford, a sense of dread gripped the town. It was the year of our Lord 1832, and whispers of a vampire had begun to slither through the shadows, igniting fear amongst the townsfolk. The tales first emerged from the lips of a distraught widow, Mrs. Agnes Pritchard, whose husband had succumbed to a mysterious affliction, leaving her with but a frail body and a heart heavy with grief. Rumors swirled like the autumn leaves caught in the biting wind. The afflicted, with pallid skin and bloodless lips, had begun to appear around the village, their eyes sunken and their spirits withered. It was said that the very essence of life was being drained from them, as if by some malevolent specter that roamed under the cover of darkness. By the flickering light of gas lamps, the townspeople exchanged hushed accounts of sightings. A tall figure cloaked in shadow, gliding silently through the narrow alleyways, leaving behind an air of dread. On the night of the first full moon of October, fear coalesced into action. A gathering was convened at the parish hall, where the clamor of anxious voices echoed against the stone walls. The vicar, a stout man with a furrowed brow, stood at the head of the room, his voice trembling as he recounted the horror of the Pritchard household. "I tell you, my brethren, this is no mere illness. We are beset by a creature of the night. We must take heed and protect our own." His fervor sparked a fervent response, and the townspeople, emboldened by terror, resolved to confront the specter. As they gathered torches and pitchforks, the night air thickened with tension, a palpable fear that gripped their hearts. The group, a motley assembly of farmers, tradesmen, and their wives, wound their way towards the graveyard, where the graves of the recently deceased lay like dark secrets beneath the earth. The undertaker, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes, had been summoned to lead the charge. He had spoken of the peculiarities surrounding the burial of Edward Pritchard, Agnes's husband, whose body had been found in a state that defied nature. Upon reaching the cemetery, the group stood before Edward's grave, the moon casting a ghostly silver light over the headstone. With trembling hands, the undertaker brandished his spade, the blade glinting ominously as it struck the earth. The sound of scraping soil filled the night like a dirge, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. As the coffin was unearthed, gasps echoed through the crowd, mingling with the rustle of the wind that seemed to carry the weight of their fears. When the lid was pried open, the sight that met their eyes sent a chill coursing through their veins. Edward Pritchard lay undisturbed, his visage marred not by decay, but by an unsettling pallor that spoke of unnatural repose. The townsfolk recoiled, their hearts racing as the specter of their fears took form. The undertaker, eyes wide with dread, leaned closer, peering into the depths of the coffin. "This is not the work of man," he muttered, backing away tremulously. In that moment, the town of Chelmsford stood at the precipice of hysteria, their fragile grip on reason slipping away into the abyss of superstition and fear. The tale of the vampire had taken root, and as the night deepened, so too did the shadows that loomed over the hearts of those who dared to gaze into the darkness. In the waning days of a chill April in 1809, the town of Chelmsford stood cloaked in the somber hues of an early evening, its streets dimly lit by flickering lanterns that cast long, wavering shadows. A restless air hung over the town, charged with whispers of dread and morbid curiosity. It was here, beneath the sodden earth of St. John's churchyard, that the body of a man named William Hargrove was unearthed, an act that would unleash a torrent of superstition and fear across Essex. The exhumation had been prompted by a series of untimely deaths that plagued the village, each more inexplicable than the last. The pallid faces of the bereaved families were drawn and hollow, their grief mingling with a growing conviction that a sinister force lurked among them. When the grave was opened, the sight that met the gathered crowd was one that would haunt their dreams. Hargrove's body appeared grotesquely swollen, an unnatural bloating that seemed to mock the very nature of death. Dark fluid trickled from the corners of his mouth, and as the onlookers gasped, one voice rose above the rest with fervor. "He is one of them, a vampire!" In that moment, Chelmsford was transformed from a quiet town into a crucible of hysteria. The crowd surged, some stepping back in horror, while others leaned closer, their eyes wide with a mixture of revulsion and morbid fascination. superstitions that had lain dormant for generations now sprang to life, weaving a tapestry of terror that enveloped the community. The town crier, a man of strident voice and exaggerated gestures, rang his bell with fervent urgency, calling forth the populace to witness the abomination. News of the discovery spread like wildfire, igniting panic in neighboring villages. Men and women, spurred by a primal fear of the unknown, began to clamor for the exhumation of their own dead, convinced that they, too, might harbor the restless spirits of the undead. The air grew thick with the musky scent of damp earth and the acrid smell of fear, as local authorities, caught between reason and the fervor of the mob, reluctantly acquiesced to the demands of the increasingly agitated citizenry. In the days that followed, graves across Essex were disturbed. Each exhumation bore witness to the same grotesque spectacle: bodies swollen, faces pallid and unrecognizable, and the unmistakable traces of dark ichor that fueled the imaginations of the terrified townsfolk. The whispers grew louder, enveloping communities in a shroud of suspicion and dread. Was it a curse, a consequence of some ill-fated transgression against the natural order? Theories flourished, each more extravagant than the last. Meanwhile, the clamor for retribution against the supposed vampires intensified. Torches flickered in the night as groups formed, armed with crude implements and a resolute belief that the undead must be purged from their midst. The old ways of the village, once held in reverence, now emerged in desperate rituals. Garlic, stakes, and fire became the symbols of a fight against the unseen forces that threatened their very existence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the land, the fabric of Chelmsford society began to unravel. Neighbors turned against one another, accusations flying like arrows in the dark. In the heart of the town, fear took root, and the specter of vampirism hung heavy in the air, a palpable dread that whispered of more horrors yet to come. In the year of our Lord 1832, a pall of unease settled over the streets of London, as whispers of the macabre began to wind their way through the gaslit alleys and bustling marketplaces. The air, thick with the scent of coal smoke and the distant echo of horse-drawn carriages, carried with it tales of the undead, specters that emerged from the shadows to feast upon the living. It was in this climate of dread that the broadsheets, those harbingers of news, both true and exaggerated, began to circulate accounts of strange occurrences in Eastern Europe. They spoke of villagers found drained of life, their pallid corpses bearing the marks of terror and despair. With each retelling, the legends of the vampire, a creature both feared and fascinated, took root in the hearts of Londoners. On a particularly foggy evening, as the thick mist rolled in from the Thames, a gathering of curious souls convened at the famed tavern, the Black Boar. The atmosphere crackled with tension, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows upon the stone walls, where patrons listened with rapt attention to the tales spun by a traveling storyteller, a man whose eyes glinted with a knowing spark. Once, in the land of Transylvania, he began, his voice low and resonant, there lived a nobleman cursed by the very darkness he sought to wield. They say he drank the blood of the innocent to prolong his reign, and now he walks amongst us, a specter in the night. Gasps escaped the lips of the audience, and a shudder rippled through the room. Among the crowd sat Eliza, a young woman of spirited disposition, her heart racing with both fear and exhilaration. She had come to the tavern seeking solace from her mundane existence, but the storyteller's words wove a spell that ensnared her imagination. The tales of the vampire spoke to her deepest fears, igniting a yearning for adventure that lay dormant within her. As the night deepened and the fog thickened outside, the storyteller continued, detailing how a band of villagers, armed with stakes and holy relics, ventured forth to confront the creature of the night. "For it is said, dear friends," he declared, leaning closer, "that only by piercing the heart of the beast can one free their souls from its grasp." The mention of stakes and the possibility of confrontation sent a thrill through Eliza. She envisioned herself alongside the brave villagers, the moonlight illuminating their path as they faced the terror that lurked in the shadows. Yet doubt lingered in the minds of many. for the very notion of the vampire felt both tantalizing and grotesque. As the clock struck midnight, a sudden crash echoed from the tavern door, causing all present to freeze in trepidation. The heavy oak flung open, and a figure stumbled through, drenched in the fog that clung to him like a shroud. His visage was pale, and his eyes glowed with a feverish intensity. "You must listen," he gasped, his breath ragged. "The vampire has come. It is no mere myth." Panic gripped the room as the patrons exchanged fearful glances. Eliza's heart pounded as the storyteller stepped forward, his skepticism evident. "What proof do you offer, good sir?" he demanded, casting a wary gaze over the trembling crowd. The man's voice trembled as he recounted a sighting, a creature with elongated fangs gliding through the night, leaving a trail of horror in its wake. The fear that had once seemed distant now surged, infecting the tavern like a plague. As the tension mounted, Eliza felt a flicker of resolve ignite within her. The vampire's legend was no longer confined to the pages of broadsheets. It had come alive. Twisting through the very fabric of London, the night promised more than mere tales. It foretold a reckoning. And with it, the specter of the vampire loomed ever closer. As the cold grip of winter descended upon London in the year of our Lord 1851, a palpable dread hung like a thick fog over the city. The chilling tales of the recently exhumed corpses began to seep through the cobbled streets and into the drawing rooms of the aristocracy. Each whispered account more ghastly than the last. Local newspapers, with their ink-stained fingers upon the pulse of public anxiety, seized the opportunity to sensationalize the findings of the recent graves opened in the outskirts of the city. In the shadow of the Tower of London, the once hallowed ground of the dead became a site of morbid fascination. The bodies unearthed bore marks of decay, yet peculiarities emerged, a strange absence of decomposition in some, and, in others, the presence of blood pooled beneath the earth, as if the very soil had absorbed life long extinguished. The ghoulish reports, accompanied by lurid illustrations of pallid figures with sharp fangs, ignited a frenzy that spread like wildfire through the streets of London. Citizens, already burdened by the hardships of the Industrial Revolution, found solace in the supernatural. They gathered in dimly lit taverns, their faces illuminated by flickering candlelight, recounting tales of shadowy figures seen flitting past graveyards at night. The newspapers, ever eager to feed the flames of fear, published articles with headlines that shouted of vampires roaming the night. Each story fed the hysteria, creating a feedback loop that entwined reality with folklore. On the outskirts of the city, a gathering of curious onlookers formed around the site of the exhumations, their breath visible in the crisp air. Men clutching rudimentary tools of excavation toiled under the watchful gaze of a small crowd, their faces pale and drawn, reflecting the macabre task at hand. The digging of grave after grave unearthed not just the remains of the long dead, but also the specter of fear that gripped the living. As earth was scraped away, the workers unearthed more than bones. Decaying shrouds and rusted iron implements suggested a dark ritualistic history that further fueled the bloody tales. Among the gathered, a woman clad in a faded bonnet and tattered shawl clutched her child tightly. "They say the undead walk amongst us," she murmured, her voice barely rising above the murmurs of the crowd, "that they thirst for the blood of the living." The child, wide-eyed and trembling, clung to her skirts, shivering not from the cold, but from the terror that danced in the air. Editorials filled with impassioned rhetoric filled the columns of the Morning Chronicle and the Times. "What manner of darkness descends upon our fair city?" they cried, as the populace begged for answers. Scholars and physicians, once respected for their reason, found themselves drawn into the maelstrom, compelled to investigate the unseemly phenomena. Their rational explanations fell flat against the fervent beliefs of the masses, who remained steadfast in their conviction that the graveyards harbored something sinister. As the exhumations continued, a dreadful irony emerged. The very act of unearthing the dead, intended to dispel the myths of the undead, only served to solidify them. The stories grew richer, more elaborate, weaving themselves into the fabric of London's nocturnal narrative. The city, alive with the heartbeat of fear and intrigue, teetered on the brink of an irrational hysteria that threatened to consume it whole. Little did they know, the true horror lay not in the shadows of the graveyards, but in the unsuspecting hearts of those who breathed life into the fables of the undead.